This morning, for our time in the Word, I was wrestling with what would you preach if you had to deliver one message prior to 2018. If I only had one address, what would that be? And I ran across an interesting article and thought about it. It's an article by Neil Postman, who was formerly an educator and a cultural critic, who wrote the highly acclaimed book entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death. He demonstrated, I think, through this article that he had his finger on the pulse of the culture in a way that most did not. In this work that he did, he compared two very well-known authors, journalists, philosophers of the past. And some of you will know who these are, and a few of you will not. The first one was George Orwell, incidentally, who wrote Animal Farm. How many have ever read Animal Farm in school? Okay. Few of you have. Secondly, he wrote a book that is entitled 1984, which was a book expressing a dark, totalitarian government that would come our way. It would be overly oppressive, even to the point where it will now tell you how to think. It will tell you what words you may use, what your words you may not use. It almost sounds plausible today, doesn't it? In other words, it was a big brother idea. It was dark. It was dystopian. It was 1984. When the year came and the prophecy did not come true, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. Phew, it didn't happen. Whatever else the terror had happened or was supposed to happen, we at least had not been visited, they said, by an Orwellian nightmare of draconian dystopia. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision or version or prophecy of the future, there was another slightly older, slightly less well-known, but equally chilling prophecy by a man named Aldous Huxley. In a book he entitled Brave New World. And contrary to common belief, even amongst those who are educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy. They did not envision the same things. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally opposed oppression. But in Huxley's version of the future, no big brother is required to deprive people of their freedom, their maturity, or their history. As he saw it, people will come. Now, get this, what he said. He says, people will come to love their oppression. That is, they will come to adore the technologies that undo their capacity to think. What Orwell feared were those who would someday ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who'd want to read one. For Orwell, he feared those who would deprive us of information. But Huxley feared that those would give us so much information. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned out in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture, but Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. Later, before his death, Huxley added that rather than people being controlled by inflicting pain, they will be controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate and fear will ruin us. And Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. It is remotely possible that both their prophecies will in some way come true. But the question I ask this morning is just, what do we love that will ruin us? Because it was Jesus who once said, "Do not love the world. And do not love the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father cannot be in him." Furthermore, the Bible teaches you and I that to love God is equally contrary to hate sin and to hate one's life, he said, in this world. And just to help sharpen that point a little more, remember that Jesus said, "Whoever does not hate his life loses it." These are hard sayings of Christ, but we need to take them seriously here. What Jesus meant was that to indulge your life so as to take aim at those things that fulfill the desires of the flesh. He means to be fixated on the things you see and yourself, that it is incompatible with a life with God. It is to love your life in this world without a living reference to God on a daily basis. So, in fact, what we do love can, in fact, ruin us. Every generation has heard some of these words. But they need to take the words seriously in that they push us to the wall of our natural reasoning. And certainly they push us to the wall of our comforts. And therefore I would suggest, in lieu of Huxley's observations, but more emphatically biblical ones, I would strongly suggest that you and I have every reason, whether prophetically or theologically, to conclude that you and I are living in the most dangerous place on earth and in the most dangerous times we could live. Did you catch that? The most dangerous place on earth. It's not North Korea that is the dangerous place on earth. It is not Iraq, Afghanistan, or Myanmar. It is not to hang around with the Taliban. But I'm referring to America and the European West as being the most dangerous place to live on planet Earth. Because it is not danger from disease. It is not danger from pollution or violence. Neither is it warfare, not even starvation. It is danger of losing our grip on spiritual realities. And nowhere does it inflict us more than in the West. It is the losing of the greater spiritual realities for the lesser, the cultural norms that we're so familiar with. It's all about replacing the greater with the lesser. Indeed, there are those who say, maybe we have already lost it as a whole. Well, I don't know. But Jesus placed spiritual realities in the most absolute terms that was possible. He put it infinitely above physical ones when he said this: "Do not fear those who can even kill the body, but not the soul. Rather," he says, "fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Fear God. What he is saying is that is the reality to which we need to be tuned. Satan now, in fact, Satan told God that a man would even give his skin to save his life. Read it yourself, Job chapter 2. All that a man has, skin for skin, he will even give that if he can just preserve his life. And Jesus is saying that that's not important. That is how radical Jesus comes across with this statement. The writer of the Hebrews was entirely devoted to warning the saints in these kinds of terms that the greater is always at risk with the lesser. Chapter 10, hang in there. Don't throw away your confidence. Run with faith. Don't give up. Fear. Lay aside those things that get entangled amongst your feet. Persevere. Don't be like Esau, who threw away his birthright for some venison stew. The greater thrown away for the lesser. And Jesus argued the very same thing, and he argues it in the scriptures time and time again, warning not to throw away eternal values for temporal ones. But the pivotal question I want to ask here, is if we don't recognize this, why not? Why don't we recognize these things? Statistics tell us that the church as a whole does not recognize these kinds of values. If it can be said, and many have, that we live in a trivial culture, that truth doesn't really mean that much, and that we have come to adore the very technologies that rob our capacity to think, then can we truly say, we're doing okay? How you doing? Pretty good? Okay. Could be doing a little better? Maybe later. Could we possibly say that? So let's look at this from Scripture itself. Then there's some very practical areas whereby we are assaulted today, living in a very dangerous world. For I see two specific areas of danger unique to most of us today. And the first one, strangely enough, is the danger of peace and affluence. The first one that we live with that is a foremost danger is the danger of peace and affluence, money, power. The great challenge in living in a prosperous and a safe environment is that it threatens to inoculate us against the real issues. So Paul in 1 Thessalonians say that when they are saying peace and safety, we've arrived, it's all about peace and safety, and then he says catastrophe will break upon them. Sudden destruction will come their way. It'll come their way like a woman that is all of a sudden going to give birth. And the question is why? Why does that happen? Were they not expecting it? And the answer is they were not expecting it. They had become clueless, is what Paul is saying. Jesus made it very clear that we have an enemy that we forget. His name is Satan. He has not taken time off. He is on a quest to rally the world against Christ and for himself. He's got a built-in problem because Jesus, that is from the very get-go, put a curse with him, with people, so that nobody really wants to be around him. So he has to disguise himself. Nevertheless, that is his desire. His demise, of course, comes. And you can read about it at the end of the book of Revelation. But he also recognizes this thing. He recognizes that the church is the one institution that the Spirit of God indwells. And that holds back this world from what would be sudden calamity. It is the church. So the question is, how would he attack the church in the West with its at least residual stability? Because in the West, we're not really that susceptible to immediate chaos, such as the Middle East. We're not prone to the fanaticism of rogue countries, but we are subject to something in particular. One thing America and the West has an abundance of, and that's relative peace and affluence. Which brings my attention to a passage in Revelation, chapter 3, which speaks to this very exact issue. Isn't it great that every issue that we can run into, the Bible tells us something about it? It's always in here. And we find it in Revelation chapter 3. If you want to turn there, if you're familiar with your Bibles, you know exactly where I'm headed. Hopefully not for trouble. And we're going to find Revelation here somewhere. Revelation 3, which he speaks about Laodicea. Laodicea. I want to go there for a moment. Laodicea, which was recognized throughout the Roman Empire because it had something. It had wealth. It had commerce. And it had a medical practice that was outstanding, second to none. It was a banking center. And it was the most prosperous of all the cities. Many big, if you were moving up in this world, you'd want to move up to Laodicea. That's where they had the great neighborhoods. Laodicea could be considered to be a kind of Bank of America, Macy's, and Mayo Clinic all rolled into one. But there were two major issues with Laodicea from God's point of view. Number one, there was a real problem with their commitment. They were not hot, on fire for God, neither were they cold. They had a kind of spiritual leukemia, is what it was, which stemmed from their second issue, and that was this. There was something wrong with their self-image. We find that in verse 17. You say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. Not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. They were dirt poor. They were dirt poor, and they didn't even know they were dirt poor. See, if you want to understand this, Laodicea didn't have a water supply. Where they got their water was an aqueduct, which ran for 6 miles before it got to them. It came from Hierapolis. So if you wanted to have a cold drink on a hot day, you'd have been pretty disappointed. If you were traveling and you were very hot, it might even have a nauseating quality to it. The water was compromised. Now think about it. Think about this. You and I do not like extremes. We don't like it really hot. I don't think anybody who lives in Michigan loves 95 degrees. If you do, just keep your hand down. And nobody loves it when it's below 0. What do we like? We like it somewhere in the middle. Put it somewhere in the middle. Because in the middle, it's comfortable. See, here you could have attended this church for years and you could have been comfortable, is what Jesus is saying. It was a comfortable place. It was a comfortable place to raise kids and to meet friends. Let me add to this being the most dangerous time, because there's something about being in the middle and being comfortable that fosters what happened in Laodicea, and that is the word apathy. Apathy and complacency or smugness brought about by relative comforts create the most dangerous attitude that a church can have. In addition, did you see it? It just makes Jesus sick. Here is a church that is going, it's doing something, but it really does exist for its own purposes. People are doing busy things. But apparently they are doing things for their own self-significance, their own pleasure. It had become a religious country club, maybe a clearinghouse for activities, but it wasn't visibly off-center. But again, we read in verse 17 that they were poor, pitiable, blind, and naked. They were in sad condition. Here is one who comes to him, Jesus, and he tells them the truth. And he speaks to a church. Well, he says they were wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. They were fat, dumb, and happy. Putting it in our terms. They were self-sufficient, complacent, and smug. Why? Because life was good. Plenty of money, maybe a beautiful church, great choir, maybe a band, and community respect possibly. But what a contrast. And they didn't know that they were poor, blind, and naked. Why such differing viewpoints? How could they be so wrong and enjoy themselves so much? Because there were two different standards that were in play. They were using two different yardsticks. Laodicea had come over time to use the markings on a ruler used by the world. By worldly standards, they were doing well, successful, growing, secure, controlling. Money was there. It is easy and it's natural and it works visibly to use the world's standards in a church setting. All you have to do is convince people that what they have is God's blessing for you to consume, and you've won their hearts. But Jesus was using a different standard. He was using the standard of the kingdom, standards that did not recognize the value of a church being a country club, a performing arts center, much less even a political action group. What did Jesus want? What did he mean? Well, if we went back to when he was on earth and speaking to us in the book of Matthew, he said that you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, you can't make it salty again. It is no longer good for anything. It is absolutely pointless. It is worthless. And it should be thrown out and trampled under feet. Because you see, when he speaks about salt, he's speaking of salt as influence. Salt was to be spread out. It was to kind of bring to life that which is. It was to bring influence to people and point them to God. But there was something else too. He also mentions light. He says, you are the light of the world, and a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Light is a symbol of truth. The church becomes a source of vision and truth and action. There is no alternative purpose for a church to get together other than salt and light. Now, here it is obvious that Laodicea, though well-intentioned, fell fatally short, and she was unawares. So in God's eyes, she was stripped naked, poor, pitiful, wretched, and blind. And if you would have asked someone at Laodicea, maybe they would have said, yes, things are great here in Laodicea. Oh, we don't get bound up in a lot of doctrine here. We don't get that because truth just divides people and makes them uncomfortable. So we don't do that. What do? We love people, L-U-V. We love people. And God says, you may love people, but you're out of it. Because you're not salt, and you're not light. And I know that you have an influence. I know that people recognize it. but the job's not being done. Note that although there is no biblical support for this, I'll admit, it is interesting that the church so well frames the last century and the present one in America, because it rides on the culmination of American prosperity, just as Laodicea did. The name, interesting enough, Laodicea means the judgment of the peoples, or the people's rights. That's the cry of our times, isn't it? But again, I notice, I want to go to the warning of Paul in his letter to Timothy, assuming I can find it, Timothy chapter 4. And he tells us this, he says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching. They have itchy ears, and they will accumulate for themselves teachers who suit their own passions. And they will turn from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." Now, they don't become irreligious. They don't go somewhere of spirit. They just tune into a different brand that doesn't tell them of spiritual realities. It keeps them comfortable. It brings to them all of the desires and pleasures of an affluent society and maintains their faith, they think, at the same time. That is what is happening. That is what Paul is concerned about. They wander from truth because it is not comfortable when one can be comfortable. If you don't like what you hear, then you're going to go elsewhere. Or as people say, I'm moving on. Question: does not the Bible teach us to follow Christ? And to follow him is to take up a cross? Did he not say that? What does that mean? Well, did he not mean to willingly embrace those things that render your flesh inoperative? Yes, he did. The hardships, the disciplines that wear down the activity of the flesh so that we are prepared for a heavenly life? Yes, he did. How does that work with self-fulfillment? How does that work with success seeking above all things? Or to be obsessed with the immediate fulfillment of personal gratification? How does that work? Is it simply paying attention to the lesser and obscuring the greater? The point is that fallen human nature seeks some middle ground. But notice what Jesus again said in Revelation. Heading back to chapter 3, eventually, he says in verse 15 this: "I know your works. They're neither hot nor cold. Would that you were either hot or cold. But because you're lukewarm, because you're in the middle, and neither hot nor cold, I'll spit you out of my mouth." What is he saying? Jesus is saying it's easier to communicate to you if you're on fire for God. Likewise, if you're totally turned off, it is easier to communicate to you because it is clear where you're not going. It's clear conviction. Thinking. It's clear where your heart isn't. You can sense conviction. But not when you stand in the middle. Not when you're in the middle. It would be better to drift off into sin. I tell you the truth. Of course, we already would be. But in some fashion that would wake us up, is what he's saying. So let me conclude here that peace and affluence have the power, if allowed, to inoculate you and I against spiritual realities and the real issues that collide with us in the world, just as it did with Laodicea. But there's even something more here that is more insidious and clever that escapes our notice. There is, in fact, a very 21st century reason why we are living in the most dangerous place and in the most dangerous times at all for the church. You see, affluence creates apathy, and apathy lets its guard down. You don't stand vigilant when you're apathetic. And when that happens, you know what? Distraction enters the door. Distraction enters the door. And the second danger is the danger of unprecedented distraction today. Now, I don't want those that are 40 and under to turn this off, but to stay tuned. I have harped on this a lot, and I'm going to harp on it again. If Aldous Huxley is correct in the prophetic picture of our times, such that people are more preoccupied with momentary pleasures than the reality of truth, then can we easily surmise that distraction is what keeps us there. There is a growing concern amongst social experts, business leaders, educators, and psychologists with the negative effects of utterly saturated, that we are a world that is utterly saturated with information. That according to Huxley, we just have to ignore it. We learn to ignore it. How many look at all their advertisements that come in the mail? Throw away the bills too, but you just get so tired of looking at stuff that you pitch it. How many study a billboard when you go by it? Nobody does. How many read a church bulletin? Don't answer that. What? Was there a meeting last night? Yeah, it was in the bulletin. I've learned not to read that. There is a growing concern here that we will become obsessed with its triviality, we become enslaved to it, and we love every minute of it. Businesses are decrying cyber loafing, cyber slacking. Psychologists point out that cyber anxieties are crippling people. Television captures the minds of most for an entire evening, removing one from real involvement and desensitizing its captives. Text messages, Twitter, and Facebook have totally conquered the attention spans of what was left over. And by the way, the creators of Facebook have admitted that they crafted their application to take advantage of human weaknesses toward the acquiring an interest in personal information, which when they receive it, they receive a dopamine hit and they feel good, which only starts the cycle to listen for another piece of usually useless information and another dopamine hit. Am I harping? You bet I'm harping. Even as I speak, there are probably a few in this room that are on Amazon. Why? Because you can. I could go on and on about the amount of advertisements that flood our homes and our roads and our shopping. But there has been no time in history where we have sustained this amount of unprecedented distractions. And then when you add to the distractions visually, then you have the audio distractions. Noise, noise, noise. And then when we don't get enough of it, we plug something in this ear and plug something in the other ear, and we listen to that all day long. You see what's going on? You see what technology, they say, always changes you for good or for worse, but it never leaves you the same. It never leaves us the same. endless sound and music thumping into our ears through direct pipelines, courtesy of portable sources eager to capitalize on all of it. And I say all of this not to tire you out, but to endeavor to draw all of your attention to the inherent dangers that are in these things. They are not just some interesting technology, but they have become and can become the most dangerous things we pull even our hands on. This is the reason. How can people even begin to think in such an extreme environment? You tell me. The ability to think God's thoughts in quietness, which is where they are thought, have no place in a noisy, distracted world. I ask you, is Satan active today? Yes, he is. We say, well, yes, he's over in Iraq. He works on ISIS's team, what's left of it. No. He works in America with affluence, with peace, with distractions. You see, God doesn't compete with billboards. You're not going to see him flash you a message and you go buy it. Neither does he purchase a slice of Facebook. He can't be felt. He doesn't expect to be just one of the many voices in a sea of confusion. He doesn't play his tunes on the radio for you. He speaks to you through the intimacy of language, is what he gave you. Language is the most intimate thing that a human being possesses. And he expects our undivided attention to using it. Why? Because he alone is worthy of it. And secondly, it is the only means whereby he communicates his love to you and his will for you. And how can we think in an environment is a serious question that demands our full attention and our responses. Distraction is nothing new, by the way. You can find it all the way through time, but you'll never find it the way we have today. And I thought about it. You find it in Luke chapter 10. There's a picture of distraction. And that's the story. I'll just go there mentally with Mary and Martha. How many know the story of Mary and Martha? And of course, they don't have the radio going, and they don't have Facebook, and they don't twittering anybody. It's a very quiet world compared to ours, but distraction affects them too, and distraction is affecting Martha. Jesus is coming. He's a good friend of the family. And Martha says, well, I don't have the table spread, and I don't have the candles out, I don't know where they are, and good heavens, what's in the freezer? I have no idea. Jesus is coming, and so she is absolutely possessed with frantic going around, and Mary's just there. Jesus comes in the door, and Mary is enjoying the presence. Wouldn't you like to have Jesus come in and talk to him? And Martha just keeps going, whizzing right on by. And Jesus confronts this busy woman. Martha, what on earth are you doing? Your anxieties have got a hold of you. Well, you won't find that in the Bible. I'm just making that up. But that's what he's basically saying. She didn't notice that she was being distracted. But she was being distracted with the lesser things, and they were replacing the greater things. And when did she notice this? Only when Jesus revealed her heart, placing her issues of anxiety on herself, telling her, it's your choice. You're choosing to do this, Martha. She failed to think about just who she was visiting. And she would have missed him entirely had Jesus not spoken. The infinitely greater given up for the lesser. Just a moment. Listen to the psalmist revealing his heart of devotion to the greater in Psalm 27:4. One thing he said, I have asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever, all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. I ask you, is that not simple? Is that not peaceful? Isn't there something just wonderful about that? Isn't that a picture of undistracted devotion? The psalmist is not thinking about his sheep. He's not thinking about the weather. He's not thinking about, he only has a few distractions. How many distractions can a shepherd have? But he's got this singular blessedness focused on the same shepherd you have today. And he says what he says. So what are we going to do? That comes down to the wire, doesn't it? What are we going to do? What are the practical responses? By the way, resistance to distraction requires muscle building. How many know that when you want to build your muscles up, you have to exert your muscles? How many don't like that? So you don't build your muscles up. You just wish they were built up. You can't build up muscles without exerting pressure against pressure. And the same thing is true with this. It doesn't come natural. And I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul, who said, all things are lawful for me, but I won't be dominated by things. I evaluate them. And he says, besides, he goes on to say in Corinthians, they don't always build me up, so I chuck them. I don't do them. So we need to become aware and to confront the challenges that dangerous times present to you. Number one, we begin with conviction. We begin with conviction. That takes us back to Revelation chapter 3, verse 18, doesn't it? Where he says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so you may be rich, and white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen. It has come to the place where I recognize I'm in the weeds. It is to ask God to evaluate your life and to reveal the condition your heart is really in. Now, that doesn't make us comfortable. How many love conviction? Actually, the child of God should enjoy conviction. There's nothing like God putting his finger on your heart. Yes, thank you. You admit conviction. Secondly, confession. You admit your addictions. What am I addicted to? It's only fair to tell you. I'm addicted to news. You say, oh, of all the things to be addicted to, why would you pick that one? I'm going along, I'm having a great time, the thoughts are pounding into my head, and all of a sudden I wonder what the government is up to. Click. Yeah, same thing. Bicker, bicker, bicker. I knew that. Now, where was I? Oh, 30 minutes recovery time. Why do I do that? Because I can. Click. I can do that. It's so easy. Technology makes it incredibly easy. So it's dangerous when it gets to that place. Ultimately, you suffer for it. Confession. Admit things. Thirdly, have a plan of action. A plan that substitutes the lesser for the greater. Now, here's where something my wife brought to me, and I never thought of it. She said, you start your day with your half hour with God, your 1 hour with God, your 20 minutes with God, you close the book, and you're off to the races. That is bad. Who said that God got 1 hour of your life and the rest is up to you? You determine that God owns 24 hours of this next period. Not the 1 hour with him, not the 30 minutes, because it's a little bit deceiving. And I am to have a God focus throughout the day in all that I do. In all that I do. And that is why the psalmist Moses said in Psalm 90, teach me to number my days. Why, Moses? So that I might present to God a heart of wisdom. So that I can be wise with my time. Because otherwise, I'm foolish with it. Secondly, under plan of action, take stock of the things that rob you of giving God all your time and determine to remove them as necessary. And you say, oh, Pastor, that is like asking me to remove my right arm. You know what it's like to pull a Facebook addict away from Facebook? It's like you'd have to pry their cold fingers off the controls. I'm just picking on one, of course. I could pick on any of them. Well, take stock, determine to do something about it. You say, well, that is so radical. That is, where do I have mine? Right here. What if somebody texts me with LOL? It might be. So what? I've got that in my pocket in case my mother calls me. No. So what? You say, well, that is so radical. I couldn't even begin to make even a cut. Well, let me tell you somebody who says something even more ridiculously radical than that. Jesus. What did he say to the Pharisees? Did I get that right? If your eye offends you, do what? Pluck it out. Throw it away. Who's he kidding? Nobody. Well, we know he's not talking about digging out your eye, but what is your eye? It is the most important organ you have. And he says, if something is that important to you, you need to deal with it. That is what he's saying. And he's not just filling up the pages of the Bible so we have something to read. He is telling us the truth about our relationship with ourselves and with God. He says, don't throw away the greater for the lesser. Thirdly, replace what you have removed with things that build you up and the things that exercise your faith. Take more time to study your Bible. Get involved in a group. Read a good biography. Throw out the romances. Seriously. Read a good biography. Just been reading Luther. I've been at Calvin. I've read Bonhoeffer. I am so excited when I read these things. I am so built up when I read about these great people of faith. Try reading one. Start a ministry. Get involved in someone's life. Exercise your faith. Get it going. Because the time is running out. We're at 2018. Fourthly and lastly, I won't bear upon you any longer than this. Make yourself, if you're serious, accountable to somebody else. Because it's so easy to say this and then say, see, I've said this, and then I'm going to slide back into the comfortable middle and do nothing. Oh, I don't say that. I just do that. Then I get involved with a lot of peripheral things that don't mean anything. But if you really mean that, and if you recognize that these things are taking out your life and your thought life, and that you can't think about God more than a few seconds before some other thought comes to you, then you need to take some pretty radical action. Tell someone. Let me just end with a quote from David, the psalmist who writes. This is my favorite passage of Scripture. Psalm 16, you make me know the path of life. In thy presence is the fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. That's my favorite verse of the Bible. I like to remind myself of that. God talks to us He ministers to us in quietness, when it's quiet and no other time. Oh, he may protect you from something stupid when some noise is going on. I'm not saying he doesn't do that. But you enjoy him in times of quietness. Father in heaven, I thank you this morning for your word that instructs us. Father, I pray, convict us, because we already are going to be trying to push this aside, because we are so connected to those things that enslave us, and we confess that we love it. Well, Father, teach us to hate it. Show to us, reveal to us, Father, what things that deprive us that we cannot control anymore, and give us victory. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.